Welcome, everybody, to the History in the Time of Pandemics, the podcast companion to the soon to be released special issue of the ISIS Current Bibliography on Pandemics. I am Nirja Sankaran, co editor of the special issue, along with Stephen Weldon, and will serve as the anchor or moderator for this series. The special issue was conceived in the wake of the first COVID wave as a first stop resource for various humanist and social science scholars on different topics concerning pandemic disease. From the very beginning, the editors realized that the project would be a dynamic endeavor with a life extending well beyond the publication of the volume of essays with their bibliographies. This podcast is a next step in realizing that vision. Through it, we will be facilitating conversations with various participants, both authors of various contributions, as well as those who reviewed or commented on the essays, in order to foster an ongoing engagement with these topics that are very relevant and seem like they will continue to be relevant for years to come. In our first episode, we will chat with participants who wrote and reviewed essays on topics that are fundamental to our understanding of pandemic and epidemic diseases in the present, past, and future contexts. The topics range in scope and focus, including such broad disciplinary categories such as epidemiology, as well as very specific concepts such as vaccinations, which has been in practically everybody's radar since the current pandemic began, as well as lesser known but hugely significant and very interesting ideas such as syndemics. Welcome, everybody. And I'll begin by asking today's participants to introduce themselves and their contributions to the project. Lukas, would you go first?
Thank you so much. My name is Lukas Engelmann. I'm a Chancellor's Fellow and Senior Lecturer at the University of Edinburgh. My position here is in Science, Technology and Innovation Studies. And I'm also leading the Epidemic Lab, which is a place where we interrogate the ongoing transformation of epidemiology by a close inspection of its many different pasts. My contributions to the special issue in the end were two different essays. One essay that I had the pleasure to write quite early on in the pandemic was on syndemics. It grew out of a concern with syndemics into what the title later became, syndemics, co-infections, and comorbidities, some interrogations of the edges of epidemiological historiography, and later on a second essay on the historiography of epidemiology in general.
I should add, Lukas was also a reviewer for an essay, in addition to being an author of two of them.
Clearly a big fan of the project.
Dora, would you introduce yourself next?
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to this podcast. My name is Dora Vargha. I'm a professor of history and medical humanities at the University of Exeter and at Humboldt University in Berlin. And currently, I'm also a visiting researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. I'm a historian of epidemics and a historian of medicine. And I'm currently leading two research projects, one based at the University of Exeter, called Connecting Three Worlds, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust, and another research project called Socialist Medicine, which is based at Humboldt University. My contribution to the project was a co-authored piece with Imogen Wilkins, who was at the time an MA student at Humboldt University. And we wrote a piece which was quite challenging to write on vaccinations.
Thank you. And Jacob?
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and be part of this conversation. My name is Jacob Steere-Williams. I'm an associate professor in the Department of History and Medical Humanities at the College of Charleston in South Carolina in the USA. I'm a historian of public health and disease and epidemics. And I served in this project as a reviewer for two different essays. So for Lukas's essay on epidemiology, which we'll have fun talking about here today, and for another, which was European perspectives on epidemics. My broader work in the history of public health is on 19th and 20th century disease and public health, I'm also associate editor of the Journal of History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. So it'd be really interesting to speak today too about how this type of project compares to other types of scholarly review and publication venues. So really looking forward to our chat.
Thank you very much, everybody. And I too am looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. I'm going to direct my first question to Lukas, since he was one of the earliest people to accept our invitation to contribute an essay and volunteer to review one, although what he ended up reviewing turned out to be a different one than the one he originally offered to review, since he ended up writing the second one as well, the one he offered to review. I requested the first topic, syndemics, because to me personally, it was a brand new term, and I felt it would address and bring lesser seen literatures to the attention of scholars who would be attracted by our resource. And the second one, as I just mentioned, Lukas undertook on epidemiology because it was a monster topic in many ways, and so large that people were volunteering to do bits and pieces, but nobody was taking it on to bring a comprehensive look at the literatures or even a fraction of the literatures. So, Lukas, could you talk a little bit about the two topics themselves, define the territories maybe for our listeners, and also provide some insights on the similarities and differences in your approach and experience of compiling the two bibliographies and writing the essays?
I'll try to do all of that in very few minutes, but I'll do my best. So I jumped immediately at the opportunity to write about syndemics in this context, and I think that's exactly what I want to talk about a bit. It's like, to some social scientists in particular, the term syndemics is by now quite familiar. And it's been a term that has been used in the social science, particularly in medical anthropology, since the late 90s, since it was more or less defined by Merrill Singer, I think in 1996, through a very important publication to describe epidemics of infectious diseases in their co-occurrence with epidemics of social phenomena, such as drug addiction or such as violence, and to provide a framework to think these kind of epidemics of different kinds, if you want, some of infectious diseases, some of behaviors, some of maybe other substances, describe these syndemics as interlocking and interdependent processes from a social science perspective. And I think since then, we've seen quite a lot of social science scholarship that has engaged with a number of different syndemics to use this term to productively engage with various kinds of epidemics in a broader, interdisciplinary, and I would say like cross-domain kind of approach. But what struck me was that this is a term that so far has been mostly bypassed in the historiography of epidemics or in the history of medicine at large. And so the task of this little essay was to try to bring these fields into conversation and try to use the existing scholarship on syndemics to bring some of the problems that they bring forward and some of the, I would say, conceptual issues when thinking about the history of epidemics into the fold of how we in the history of medicine commonly think about the history of epidemics and what that might change. And one thing that I highlight in the essay and that I keep highlighting in many other places is that there is a very strong convention, and sometimes it's so strong it's almost a kind of like the it seems quite exclusive in the historiography of epidemics, and that is you write the historiography of epidemics as biographies of specific epidemics. There are books about AIDS, there are books about TB, there are books about typhoid fever, as some might know here, there are books about polio. So we're all guilty in that, yeah, each and every one of us. And it's not a problem, obviously not, but it is a rather remarkably stable convention how the historiography tends to reify and reestablish those kinds of frameworks of thinking about the history of epidemics. And syndemics brings a different tack to that and offers an opportunity to maybe rethink some of the ways in which we prioritize the main actors of the narratives that we want to tell.
Does anybody have any questions specific to what Lukas has been talking about?
To pose a challenging question, then if we make it, what you describe is basically making it more complex of what we're looking at and what we're studying. But it's already so complex and so difficult to get a really thorough understanding of any epidemic, even if you only look at one single disease. What does that look like in reality if one wants to really follow this?
I think that's a really good question, and it's one that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think this is we have a number of different options there. I would say it's like one of the options is to fully embrace the complexity, and in some ways I would say like follow the footsteps of what mathematically modeler do, yeah? And say like none of the materiality out there matters. Yeah, it doesn't matter if it's a pathogen, it doesn't matter if it's an idea that circulates. Everything circulates in various ways. Everything impacts on each other, and all we can do is kind of like try to develop some pathways in which it might seem to make sense to connect the dots and create some nice graphs that then in and of themselves are supposed to say something. So we might, of course, like if we do that and if we follow that model, we might end up with very unsatisfying results that are not much more than quantitative estimates of something that has spread at some point. Yeah? So, but I think what the other options is to think about this as a bit of a way of decentralizing the disease and the category of disease in the way that we tell stories. And I think that comes quite close to what we are, at least in a large part of the history of medicine, are already doing, thinking about the history of epidemics as sampling devices to tell other stories that are already part of that, you know. And I feel like in strongest terms, like this is an emphasis for that, to do that even more confidently and even more emphatically, I guess is the word, to tell a story about an epidemic so that we can tell the stories about all the kind of factors that we can see and that we can make sense of, that bring that epidemic to something that has become a issue, a problem, a public health issue, or a crisis. Yeah.
I've been rereading this syndemics essay, Lukas. So thank you for all the work you put into it for something I'm working on right now. So with the Journal of the History of Medicine, I put together a special issue of rethinking pandemic and epidemic methodologies. So how we even approach the study of these things, which I think has been like a really fruitful kind of rethinking moment where we are, that we can inflect with all of the amazing work that historians of medicine and public health and science and technology have done in trying to situate COVID-19. And one of the things that I find really useful about the idea of syndemics is, and this is something that actually Dora has written about as well, is rethinking the kind of episodic nature of epidemics, and the way in which our historiographies and methods, particularly the kind of disease biography methods, have tended to situate in time and space epidemics as episodic. And I think like one of the things that syndemics does as a concept is methodologically forces us to break from that method and that idea being two different things. And the other that I'm sort of playing around with, at least in my essay, which is a sort of broad framing essay to start the special issue, is using methods from disaster studies and thinking about the idea of slow disasters. And I wonder, like either Lukas or Dora, what you thought about how syndemics and slow disaster maybe can work. There's a sort of Venn diagram there in methods and approach that we can use to sort of breaking from some of these conventional ways of approaching the study of pandemics and epidemics.
So just reflecting on that, I remarked in the beginning that it was challenging to write about vaccination, and partly for that reason of, just pinpointing what that is and where it's bound, where either temporally or, in its object. It was very, very challenging. And I think there is a lot to say about breaking boundaries and these ideas that bound us to very, very widespread and maybe wishful thinking of how epidemics, what they are and what they mean. But I still find it very challenging of then, how actually to do the doing of that, and how to build a narrative and an analysis, sidestepping that kind of the boundaries.
You asked for an example, and I think maybe there are many examples for syndemics. The concept, as it was defined by Mary Singer, is deeply embedded in the HIV/AIDS crisis as a history that was, I think, for a long time, the main paradigm to think not only about pandemics and epidemics, but also to think about a pandemic that needs to be seen in its very specific geographic context as a pandemic that in those contexts has very different kinds of profiles once you look at the wider determining factors of the kind of numbers that you see. And there is one example is and that goes more like towards co-infection than rather than to syndemics, is that TB is the major killer for people with HIV on a global scale. And so you have an already de facto interlinkage between the long histories of TB and the not so long histories of HIV, that if you look beyond the European and North American areas, you cannot disentangle those stories, but you need to tell them somewhat conjoined. And that provides us with a lot of difficulties, because if you look at the historiography of TB and HIV/AIDS, these are two neatly piles of books that do rarely intersect at all. Yeah? But there are other examples. I think in all our scholarship, we probably could dig into there. There is, if you go towards the early 20th century history of plague, you have a question of, on the one hand, of a history of an infectious disease that reemerges after it was thought to be kind of like a story of medieval Europe, but it reemerges in a totally different setting and brings with it a whole different set of questions around maritime transport, around the question of the animal vector, around the questions of poverty. There's a lot of questions of ethnicity and race that are associated. There's a lot of questions, especially in the American West, there's a lot of questions about housing that are directly associated with the foci of the emergence of plague. And these are not just kind of, and I think the trick with syndemics is to not say that this is just a social determinant of the disease and therefore it needs to be kind of prioritized over other things, but to open the lens, open the frame, and be able to tell those stories as interlocking stories that mutually, that have effects onto each other, that don't just go in one direction. Yeah. So, and I think that's the power that lie in that framework.
Could you also relate it to the current topic that's in everybody's minds, which is COVID-19?
I think the syndemics of COVID-19 have been described in some detail in the scholarship. There are some cases where you can connect this directly to the examples that I just mentioned. So in South Africa, I think there's some good research that has shown that there the TB and HIV epidemic are actually quite co-occurrent with the hotspots of COVID infections, and that there seem to be mechanisms at place that are not quite clearly understood. Again, another strength of this framework, you can do kind of like the work of describing the co-occurrence of different epidemics in the same places at the same time without needing a full-on working explanation of the mechanics that drive those. But I think you can also think, if you take, for example, the British example of COVID-19, I think it's much more appropriate to look into questions of employment and which kind of employment strata, which kind of sections of the workforce were more vulnerable to the infection with COVID-19. Bus drivers was one of the factors that were brought up a lot in here. Another factors was delivery drivers, which not only had, due to the precarious circumstances of their job, had to show up for the job, but also continued to be faced with high infection rates. And another example of a syndemic, of course, is the emergence of mental health cluster in the wake of COVID-19 infections and in the wake of lockdown measurements as a reaction to COVID infections. So you have multiple cascades in which syndemic simply allows you to create a narrative framework to capture these stories.
Thank you, Lukas. I'm going to give you a break, and rather than make you talk about the second question I had, I'll return to that, because I feel like since we're talking about one specific issue, and Dora mentioned writing about the historiography of vaccinations was rather challenging in this context. Dora, could you tell us a little bit about your essay and how did it develop, the bibliography itself, and I gave you this rather bold request. Could you write one on vaccines or vaccinations? And you, together with your co author, did a really effective job. I mean, both reviewers and listeners can easily go see the reviews, were very forthcoming in their praise of your essays. So, what areas do you see overlapping with your contribution? That's one of my questions. And what did you find yourself leaving out of the bibliographies, maybe, or of discussions?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this was such an amazing thing to think about in the middle of the pandemic, and it took quite a lot of time to actually figure out how we can, get a grip on the subject, because it is, as we've just talked about, it is a bit of a history of everything. And first of all, it was thinking about, okay, are we writing about vaccines or are we writing about vaccination? And how, what does that say about how we think about things? And because that, I think is important in thinking about where the boundaries of that subject lie. And then realizing that, of course, it is really the history of everything, is the history of biomedical sciences, of how vaccines are produced, and of microbiology, of virology, animal studies, where the materials into the vaccine are coming from. Then it is a history of pharmaceutical companies. It is a history of inequality, and a history of political control. And then you have the social history of it all, of how a vaccine as an object is basically inseparable from the vaccinators, the vaccinees, the bodies, and the infrastructure. So basically, what we had was this big blob of everything, and it was a very difficult but rewarding process to think together with Imogen about how we then try to look into this in more detail, and at the same time give a kind of overview of the historiography. And when Lukas was describing how stacks of books are separate, you could have on vaccines, there's a very particular set of books and historiography that have vaccine as a main target. But then you have millions of stacks of books on virology. You have stacks of books on biographies of pathogens, right? You have stacks of books on epidemics that are all relevant to this. So the challenge was to find select a number of lenses, and we chose three through which we can actually approach and give an overview. So it had to be restricted, and it had to be targeted. And so what we decided to do is to focus on space and time. And this, for me specifically, was a very interesting thing to think about, because it brought two things together that I've been thinking about quite separately. And one has been the politics of disease and health, through this research that I'm involved in looking at socialism and the socialist world in global health. So that kind of the geographies of that, and how that matters, of where, what kind of political context vaccination is being developed and rolled out, and how people think about it. And then also through time, temporality, because I've been also thinking about, what kind of flipping around a bit how we think about epidemics, to shift attention to the after the end. And this has been something that Lukas and I have been talking about for a long time, and seeing what kind of ideas of time are encoded in vaccination. What are the expectations of how this will be developed and rolled out, and actually what is the end goal of a vaccine? So this is where we try to frame it. And of course, one other issue that was just shouting at us, and that we had to make a very important part of the essay, was vaccine resistance and vaccine hesitancy, because it is especially reflecting on COVID-19, but also because it is always a part of vaccination, is why that sometimes doesn't happen, why people would be against vaccination, or how it's contested and how it's negotiated. So these were the three big sections that we decided to explore, which meant that there was a lot of overlap with all the, with epidemics, with a lot of the essays in the collection, but we also had to leave out quite a bit, unfortunately.
Thank you. Actually, that'll bring me back to Lucas to talk for a few minutes on your epidemiology essay, because there too, I imagine you had to leave out a lot, include other stuff. How did you make those decisions? And how was the experience different in a way than writing about syndemics?
It was agonizing. I was just thinking when listening to Dora that I think a lot of the work that one does in these bibliographic essays is to go through the literature of what I enjoyed reading and trying to build out from there how that kind of like sits in the wider landscape, and how that kind of creates almost like a reference networks in which you are the first node, and the other nodes then kind of like pop out from there outwards. And that was kind of, I think that was in the end the approach that was the only one that worked for me in the epidemiology essay. To say like, the only way I can write this is to have a highly biased view that is exactly the view that I have, and that's the view that I have of the kind of more the way how this landscape of literature can be clustered. I decided to cluster it in those accounts of the history of epidemiology that are written by epidemiologists themselves, and accounts of epidemiology are written by historians. But it was, of course, clear that this is a somewhat arbitrary division that doesn't really do justice to everyone that finds itself in there. But such is the fate of classification. And then from there on, it was a question really of trying to find a way to cluster the historiography of the field of epidemiology rather than the historiography of epidemiology as a practice. And that made it somewhat easier. So really focusing on those texts that I know of and that I am familiar with, but also those that I'm not necessarily familiar with, that focus on epidemiology as an emerging field, as an emerging science in the 20th century, and as a set of practices that lead to some people calling themselves epidemiologists, and then also histories about those epidemiologists. So that was the kind of like narrowing factor. But at the same time, I'm very aware you can tell the story completely different if you want. You could tell the story entirely, as many of the practitioners do, from a mathematical angle, and build the networks of epidemiology completely around the kind of questions of how certain ideas from physics and chemistry have informed epidemiological thinking in the early 20th century. You could tell the whole story by looking geographically very different. And I'm sure there is literature not in English that is hugely relevant and very important from Russia, from Latin America, that I could not include due to existing language barriers, which I hopefully also made quite clear in that essay. But so these were some of the considerations to narrow that down into somewhat manageable task. Still enjoyed it though.
Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. So I've been thinking about both of your essays and your reflections here just now. And one of the things that strikes me, and both as a preface, Lucas and Dora and I have had started some of these conversations in the past through my work in co-hosting COVID calls podcast. And what I wondered about both the epidemiology essay of Lucas's and the vaccination essay of Dora's is, you're doing a couple things at once each, which is one, trying to sort of like frame out these enormous fields of study and historiographies, but two is like the huge elephant in the room for all of us doing any kind of humanistic work during the pandemic, is you were dealing with how to frame these topics that have immediate political concern and life and death concern in real time while you're writing them. And so, like, Lucas, you and I have chatted in the past, and I wondered what your reflections are now. Like, before COVID-19, I would reckon to say that the vast majority of people had never even heard of the word epidemiology. And I say that because so many people, when I hear them talk about it, in even today in real time, everyday speak, they can barely pronounce the word. And but like they really don't understand what this field is or what it refers to. And then Dora, like I think about your essay, And while vaccination in the 21st century is all pervasive, I heard so many people in everyday conversations in the world just talk about why do vaccinations have to be so political, around COVID-19. And like, as scholars, we know the answers to this, and your essay does a brilliant job of sketching it out. But I wondered for both of you, like, how much did you reflect on the sort of immediacy of the consumption of these topics while both framing them out as scholarly ones? Because I think, like, in part, that's the sort of goal of this project too.
Thank you for that, Jacob. I think that's such a great point, and also picking up on what Lukas was saying. I think that's kind of okay. This is where we are coming from to it, right? We are all, coming with our own interests and our own academic agenda, if you will, to how we frame these enormous fields and try to give an overview. I think for me, it was a huge opportunity for learning as well, and learning my own limitations in this. And that was, just coming back to the point of language, and to realize, how much there is actually out there that we don't necessarily know, and that made me think a bit more, as you're putting together a bibliography and an overview of a history. It's also an exercise of power, and who you're highlighting, and who you are including, and who is left out. And that, to be very conscious of that work, but also very conscious of the, and at the end, the geographical spread of where that scholarship comes from. So I think that was a real wake-up call to think about it. And the other point, which is kind of directly connected to that, is the politics of it all, and the immediacy of that. I think in this as well, I've become less and less apologetically political, and that I found that can, sometimes raise eyebrows, to say the least, in certain academic contexts. But I think that is very important to address head on, because it is, as we know, it's always been political. But I think there is no reason why we should pretend or inhibit some kind of remote objectivity around this, when we could rather maybe more usefully engage with the politics of it, and make that much more present and much more clear.
Thank you, Dora. In fact, in a future episode, we will be featuring a speaker who wrote an essay on politics. Meanwhile, Lukas, did you have anything to respond to what Jacob said?
I think it brings me to the kind of question of what these essays are supposed to do in times of an epidemic crisis. In one way, and responding to Jacob, I think it's a question that remains a somewhat open question, right? And it's not easy to answer what these essays will do and what they can do. I know they work as a valuable resource in a place where they might not always be as visible as they could be as such resource. They are kind of places that you turn to, at least in my case, I did, and my colleagues here did, turn to those essays to look at some of the to just get a quick grasp of what already is out there, what are the major themes that you might pick up on before you develop your next piece on X and Y, responding to some of the questions that might have come up in this pandemic, relating to some of the issues in this pandemic. And it feels certainly in my corner here is that you cannot write any article without somehow fiddling COVID-19 into the first paragraph, even if the rest of the story goes somewhere else. Yeah. And hopefully we'll move beyond that at some point in the future. But the other point I think is also, at least to me, is that what these essays do is they shape up a field. They bring a field together. They bring the historiography of epidemics and pandemics into a visibility with each other that didn't quite exist before. We all were kind of like a crowd, at least in our case. We all have had lots of chats with each other on lots of conferences that we meet, but usually these were history of medicine conferences. Sometimes these were conferences in STS or in other places, but there is this community of people working on the history of pandemics and epidemics, historians of epidemics or pandemics, as we all introduced ourselves. that have come to be somewhat, what's the word for that? I wouldn't quite say established, but like on the way of establishing ourselves as a global community of scholars in that way. And that's certainly something that these essays have helped a lot with.
Anybody else want to add to this?
I mean, just quickly, one of the things that I've been like meta conscious about throughout the entire pandemic, and anyone who's even done a cursory glance at this collection of essays, or is familiar with the historiography of epidemics and pandemics, is familiar with, is that and the classic example is the scholarship that came out of the mid 1980s to the late 1990s, specifically responding in many ways to the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so much of that scholarship on the history of disease and the emergence of disease biographies as a kind of methodological approach, to go back to Lukas's comment, in that era, it was always like an introductory paragraph about HIV/AIDS or an epilogue about HIV/AIDS, even though the topic was on something vastly different in historical project. And I feel like we've both we're in the middle of doing that now, but I hope that we're also doing it in a different way, because I think I look back on that scholarship and think about like some of Charles Rosenberg's work, just for as an example, because it's one that many people are familiar with, and it seems very dated to the 80s and the early 90s. And I wonder, like, if there's some inevitability that our scholarship now will feel like that in 40 years as well. But I also hope that we are not just reifying the same sort of pitfalls of those approaches as well.
If I may, in the end, just maybe one way to think about it is that this pandemic has given an opportunity to take stock of what has been done, which is not something that one would usually do, beyond one's own research when you're trying to, get a feel for the field. But as a collective effort, I think that is unique, and I think that is what there's huge value in, what has been produced and what the COVID-19 has given an opportunity for. And presumably, in 40 years there will be another occasion to revise and look back and maybe move forward. But I think there is a kind of building on and engaging with rethinking process going on that I feel that this might be a crucial moment in.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now and ask you all about your experience of the open peer review system that we used for this collection. Like the project itself, this was very much the result of Stevens, who's absent from this conversation, but still very much a meta presence. It was his vision, and he was very keen that we go ahead with it. It met with some initial skepticism, especially from some members of our advisory board. And at one point, we agreed to stop using the label of reviewers, although we eventually slid back to that terminology. Now, most of you have experienced the process now from either or both ends. And could you comment on the value of this open system for a project like this one? Jacob, being that you've reviewed a couple of essays, would you go first on this? And then please, Dora and Lukas, also chip in with your experiences.
Yeah, thanks. This is obviously a really important question for this project, and I think it's one that is not new to this project. Of course, it's one that I think is an ongoing question about scholarship in general, and what I saw as the real value of an open peer review system that these bibliographical review essays followed is really an opportunity. Dora just mentioned this and talking about, I guess Lukas did too a while back, about how what the COVID-19 pandemic has enabled is a kind of stepping back moment to assess the field, and also to expand our networks, our scholarly networks. And that's something that I have found very empowering in the last 3 years, is forging new relationships with scholars around the world through all of the various social media interactions, but also through public conversations, through podcasts, through online conferences. There's been a kind of new connectivity of both scholarly connections and also public and and open conversations with various public audiences. And more than anything else, I found that to be incredibly generative and new for my own ideas, but I think for our field as well. And so I think the value of this approach that ISIS has done has been to provide another venue to make and to extend those kind of connections. Obviously, I don't think, double-blind peer review is going anywhere soon within our scholarly protocols of publishing, but I do see an enormous value in an open peer review system, because it really, at least as a reviewer, I don't think I was any, Lukas, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I was any less critical of, in my reviewing process and my assessment of the two essays that I reviewed. But I did feel, because I am familiar with the two authors that I reviewed of their essays, that I did feel connected to them. Lukas, you had this sort of visual model of how you approach the epidemiology essay of you starting as the node. And I think there's a really interesting way in which, like, as a reviewer, I both inherently knew that was the approach, but also could, because I knew you, could help, I think, to be able to provide a kind of analysis, but then also maybe a couple, helpful points to move the essay forward. And I think that model of scholarship is really, really quite innovative and cool. And as opposed to, being against it, I think we should find more venues to do this sort of thing.
I have to think about like on a certain social media website that we no longer advertise on, or about someone left a very short blog, because it's a short blogging social media website. Note that it would be nice as a historian to be able to publish albums and have collaborating artists on these albums. Yeah. And I think in a way you described exactly that right now. Like in a many way, the open review process does that. It's kind of like allows you to arrive at a result that has a kind of like multiple authors on that. And it's not just kind of like one has written it and the other person has kind of like given a bit of a support here and there, but we end up with a result that is kind of a collaboration and has this kind of way of using almost like a convention that is very common in the musical world. Yeah, to bring things together to produce something quite different that you would be producing if it was you on your own, and if you had the kind of privacy of the double-blind peer review feedback, in which you can make very different choices of how you deal with your feedback as well. Yeah, and I think I was in both of these essays in the position of receiving very generous, high quality, fantastic feedback. Again, I think the public nature of the feedback shifts things in that direction as well. But for a genre like this, summative essays that provide an overview and are trying to create a snapshot of the state of a field, it's a fantastic instrument to create more cohesion towards the greater good for all, right? And hopefully great albums.
I have to agree. For me, it was making visible the conversation and all the work that goes into producing an essay of any kind, basically, of how many people are involved in and the actual work that they put in. And it felt also that that kind of interconnectedness was wonderful, because even I wrote a co-authored essay, so I was not writing alone. We were in constant conversation with each other, but it still can feel like you're kind of writing something. You send it off into the world. You get some kind of feedback. You kind of deal with it on your own and go through this process without actually being connected to the people who are actually in conversation with. And this way, it was wonderful to see not only my own, but to see other people's conversations as well. And I think that was fantastic to see how ideas evolve in real time and how essays evolve from one version to the next. And that I found very, very interesting and the kind of very positive way of experiencing. I'm not sure that it would work in all context, because of course it brings up all kinds of other issues of power and so on. But for this project, I think it was a wonderful idea, and I'm really glad. I was skeptical at first, but I was very happy to take part in this way.
Thank you. I know I'd requested you to also be a reviewer, but then that essay never happened. So unfortunately, we didn't get the chance. But Lucas, you actually also reviewed an essay, and it was related somewhat, I think, to your topic of epidemiology. Could even be considered a subset, or there's overlaps, right? Could you talk a little bit of your experience as a reviewer rather than being reviewed, which you already did and pointed out the generosity of your reviewers?
A very positive experience. That is no question. I think I would say what makes it interesting is that you approach the review on a very different level. Because I'm not saying kind of like that you suspend your critical faculty and go in with a kind of what are the nice things that I can say after I have to swallow all the grievances. No, but the difference really is that you know the author and you know who the author is. That's the first thing. And you also, so you can identify where this is coming from and how this is sitting in someone's scholarship, how this is sitting in someone's career trajectory, and so on and so on. And that it gives you a lot of information to adjust how you approach this review and how you use your review to support the writing of this text. And I think that I found really, really useful and made actually reviewing this a lot easier than reviewing some of the articles through double blind that I had on my desk. Of course, also it requires a different level of attention to the kind of intentions that are already been in place and a kind of way of engaging with the overall trajectory of the essay, because you want to, I guess the reviews were written in my case, and I felt like looking at the reviews of most of the articles that I've seen, the reviews were written with a kind of aspiration to get things into a shape so they are contributing to the overall goal of the special issue. So there were certain goals already very clear. And again, that's a different factor from having a double-blind peer review article from Journal X, where you have to have a very different look at the kind of goals that are stated within the paper, and you have to review the paper on the limits that the paper itself kind of like offers, and so on and so on. So I think what I want to emphasize is like I found this process very interesting, how open review in this case necessitates a very different framework of thinking through the scholarship in front of you, but also how it shifts the way you relate to the author once you know him. What it doesn't change, and that I think is the important part, is that you still have to engage with the scholarship as best as you can. And that provides you with the same challenges you have in double-blind peer review, is taking the kind of issues that you have and then finding a way to articulate those issues as fairly, but also as strongly as you can, so that they are out there and can be acknowledged and hopefully also incorporated.
Thank you. I've asked all the main questions I wanted to, but I wondered what you had for each other, comments and questions for each other before we end the session.
No, I mean, I think the big question that we all need to be asking ourselves, and everyone that's contributed to this project, and also will read this project, is how, this in the end, at the end of the day, like what this set of bibliographical essays will do is provide a kind of snapshot. And I think, like, what I hope that we are all asking ourselves is, how can we continue to have these conversations and to do this kind of collaborative work? That I think is the big question, so that we don't need another global pandemic to be able to take this kind of snapshot of our field. Maybe that's the question that we really need to ask.
Perfect. Thank you all very much. It's been very illuminating. We hope that this special issue will be out within the next month and a half, and that then people will get to actually read the final versions. Just as a point to be made, every version of the essay and the comments on those versions of the essays, as well as the accompanying bibliographies, are available via the ISIS Current Bibliographies website. The consortium will be providing a link. This has been a recording of a consortium of history of science, technology, and medicine based in Philadelphia. The conversation we had today was on April 24th, 2023. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, everyone.